All right, hello and welcome everyone to the ICAST 2020 Online Conservation Seminar Series. I'm Mike Leonard, ASA's Vice President of Government Affairs. Glad you all could be with us today for this important topic we're going to discuss, which is looking ahead to election 2020, how the balance of power in Washington may shift, and implications for the sport fishing industry. This session's a little different than the other seminars we're doing in that, the others are policy issue focused. This one's a little bit broader and looking at kind of big picture politics, presidential, Senate, House races, and we've got some great experts on today to help us look ahead and start doing a little bit of guessing and looking at numbers and what might be coming up as we look ahead to November, to the extent that that's still in the back of people's minds. All the major events over the last several months, between coronavirus, all the social justice issues going on. A lot of us kind of forget that there is a presidential election coming up here in a few months, but thankfully we've got some experts here that have been very tuned into that and will give us some great perspective as we look ahead to what might be coming up. So introducing the other presenters, all of which are partners at Forbes State Partners, which is a government relations firm here in Washington, D.C. that we at ASA have been working with for several years. So welcome George Cooper, partner at Forbes State. George has worked directly with us at ASA for George, about 10 years now, I think, and has been a great asset for us, tremendous expertise in natural resource policy, and has done great work for us. Also joining is his colleague Doug Usher, who is a sort of a numbers guy, a pollster, and public polling expert who will have a lot of great insights into as we look ahead to the races coming up. And then also Rick Murphy, a partner at Forbes State. Rick has many decades of experience working on the Hill, including as Chief of Staff for former Senator Kelly Ayotte of New Hampshire. And Rick has, again, a lot of great expertise and great finger on the pulse of what's happening in Washington, D.C. and elsewhere. So welcome, gentlemen. Really appreciate you all being with us.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Mike.
So with that, George, I'm going to turn it over to you and let you get us rolling here. So here's the controls of the presentation, and have at it, George.
Great. Thanks very much, Mike. And I am actually in turn going to hand this to my colleague, Doug Usher, in short order, just to give you a little bit of a sense of where we're headed. We will start by looking at some general dynamics that we view as currently shaping the election landscape and things that we think are going to carry into November. I think predicting electoral outcomes this particular cycle is more fraught than ever. My friend and colleague Doug can speak to that. But after we look at some general dynamics that we're keeping a close eye on, we'll move into some of the most compelling data and opinion trends we're seeing shape the presidential election process. Doug will take us through that. And then we'll move on into what the Senate races look like, the likelihood of a change from Republican control to Democratic control. And then we'll finally land on the House and take a similar look at the prospects for change there, whether House Democratic numbers may grow, et cetera. So that's where we're headed. And with that, I will hand it off to Doug.
Sure, great. Thanks, George. And if we just want to go to the next slide, I think the most important thing we want to recognize as we talk about the 2020 election is just how unusual the 2020 election is. Even before COVID, even before a lot of the social justice, racial justice turbulence that's been happening lately, this was shaping up to be an unusual campaign. We had a president who, as you all know, certainly acts in ways that are non-traditional, to be polite, but does things in a very different way. That extends to his campaign itself. And one of the things we were watching very closely before everything of the last few months was how President Trump had continued to build his social media presence. And that goes well beyond Twitter. It has to do with the people that are active that support him as well. And we see that as a potential built-in advantage for President Trump that would help him very much in a close election. With that said, COVID-19 changes and causes further disruption to what was going to be a little bit of a non-standard campaign. Obviously, we've seen the tremendous shutdowns of rallies, of traditional wholesale campaigning. That has, I think, a tremendous impact below the presidential level, but certainly after the recent failed event for President Trump in Tulsa, or certainly the one that didn't work out as he wanted, it shows the challenges. And on the flip side, Joe Biden has been doing relatively well in the campaign perspective with small events and staying in the background largely. That may turn out to be something that impacts the actual campaigning itself. You can go to the next slide, please. Additionally, one of the things that I think we really want to be thinking about is the impact on turnout and the impact on the types of ways that campaigns try to figure out who to target. Again, unprecedented times. There either could be a flood of new participants in the election because of the growth in mail-in ballots. On the other hand, there could be a lot of distraction. There may be court cases and fights around whether mail-in ballots will or won't be valid and the reasons why people use them. There'll be fewer people voting in person, most likely. So again, some of the things we use to predict elections, which include what does the electorate look like, who is most likely to participate, who's less likely to participate, that all goes into the prediction business and also in the targeting business for campaigns. That's going to be different this year. With all of those factors, we have to realize that everything we put into understanding elections and predicting elections and trying to figure out who's going to win and who's going to lose has a little bit of added uncertainty that we really didn't predict going in. Of course, nobody predicted COVID-19 or some of the changes that have been happening socially in the US. With all of that, plus the candidates who are running, we have to assume a level of uncertainty. And with that, I'll open up to a couple of comments from some of my fellow panelists.
Thank you, Doug. I think the clear point is it is the uncertainty, because if you think what we've witnessed already in this year, we had the killing of the Iranian terrorist, we've had the impeachment trial, we've gone to COVID, and we've had the Black Lives Matter. So we've really spent in the first 6 months of this year about a decade. And so depending on how events come in the next 123 days, I believe it is, as we go to tape here, a lot can happen.
Doug, can you say something? We've had some primaries were delayed, and there's been a lot of disruption in voting around primaries in various states. But anything you're seeing in whether it's turnout or trends around primaries, enthusiasm from either Democrats, Republicans, or both, anything that's telling you as we look ahead to November?
I think it's a great question, because I think one of the things we're seeing is there is still relatively decent turnout, which is to say people are turning out in spite of potential risk. We saw it in Wisconsin about a month and a half ago. We saw it in New York and Kentucky, where people are able to turn out. They're finding ways to participate in the process. I think the second most important thing about the primaries is just how some of the predicted outcomes didn't come true. We just saw another member of Congress from New York State essentially fall. Elliot Engel has not conceded yet, but it looks like he's going to fall to a new candidate, an African-American, I think middle school or high school principal. And this comes on the heels of the Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez defeat of Mike Crowley in 2018. We also saw in Kentucky the putative Democratic nominee to go against Mitch McConnell almost get beaten by somebody who's raised almost no money, another African-American candidate who represents a little bit more of the left flank of the Democratic Party. So to the extent we're seeing enthusiasm, we're seeing a little bit more enthusiasm in those Democratic primaries for change. It's a little tough to tell whether it's Republican or Democratic, because there just isn't a solid Republican presidential primary. Republicans aren't that motivated right now on the primary level to get out as Democrats are.
Okay. Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Mike.
Yeah, Doug, or really George, Rick, whoever wants to take this one. Yeah, so President Trump had the rally in Tulsa where I think it's kind of safe to say across the board the turnout was pretty underwhelming. You know, leading up to his victory last time, you know, at least he felt that those in-person rallies were a huge part of you know, demonstrating broad public support. To the extent those aren't going to be able to occur over the next several months, I don't know, how do you see that playing out? To what, if any, you know, weight do you give to those turnouts in the past, and if they don't happen this time around with rallies, what impact that might have?
To me, I think the biggest impact on that is the impact it has on the president mentally. Those rejuvenate him, they inspire him, they give him confidence. Quite honestly, since that event, we have not seen a public-facing President Trump.
And I'll add to that, you know, we all know the famous Tip O'Neill saying that all politics is local. I think for President Trump, all politics is personal. And he takes personal pride in filling seats, in high ratings. And I think, exactly to reinforce Rick's point, every campaign, and all of us have worked on campaigns and been around candidates, you've got to find the thing that motivates your candidate, because it is a really hard job to be a candidate at any level, especially, of course, on the brightest stage of all. And with him not having that, I think it will cause some motivation issues. I dismiss any of this talk of him dropping out or not wanting to win. He wants to win. I just think that when you take a look at it and see what makes him excited, the campaign needs to find other ways to make him engaged and excited. So it's going to be more disappointing to him rather than being, you know, a true indicator of his support.
Okay. All right. So with sort of big picture dynamics in mind, we'll take it into a look at, speaking of President Trump, the presidential election specifically. And Doug's got some info here for us. I just skipped past one. I'll go back to the first one. So looking at comparisons on job approval ratings.
Yeah, so I think you know, this is a tough number for President Trump right now. It's not problematic or certainly just completely ruinous in and of itself. President Trump has never seen the kind of bumps in opinion that other incumbents have had, which is to say that some of his predecessors have seen their approval move between a pretty wide range and at certain points been at or above 50. President Trump has really never been above 50 during his time as president, and he's seen a downturn lately. Again, not fully predictive, but having a job approval in the mid 40s or higher is really important, because when it comes to re-election, it's essential. You know, your vote is in a lot of ways going to match your approval. And so he may outperform it by a couple points. To be clear, President Trump far outperformed his favorability rating in 2016. That's how he won the presidency. But as an incumbent president, I think his campaign would want to see his numbers a little bit higher than they are right now. Let's go to the next slide. Now, having said that, it's important to note that Democrats have what we call an electoral vote problem. And what we mean by that is, to get to 270 votes, Democrats need to overperform. Again, this is based on 2016, but they basically need to get to 52 or 53% of the vote if everything holds constant. Why does that happen? That happens because Democrats do much better in big states. In a lot of ways, they have a problem where they're winning states like California and New York, huge vote states, by 15, 20, 25 points. But then they're winning smaller states by small margins. And so the campaigns, the Democratic side is racking up votes in states that are safe. And so if you take a look at it, that's why it takes more than just a majority, a simple majority for Democrats to win. By contrast, and this is not done on purpose, it happens to be where things are right now, states like Texas, Georgia, et cetera, large states, Florida, that President Trump won in 2016, he won them by a small margin. That's how you translate just a slim electoral vote or a slim popular vote majority into an electoral vote defeat, which is what happened to Hillary Clinton. Again, that's another piece that makes this a little bit uncertain. It could be an accident of history, but it's where we are right now, that the Biden campaign has to be very cautious and recognize that unless they either change that dynamic or build up margins beyond where they were before, it's a challenge for Democrats to win the presidency just on a straight, even line vote. Now, with that said, we think about the economy when we think about a presidential success. And one of President Trump's biggest strengths going into the election cycle, certainly in 2020, was the strength of the economy. It was objectively, looking at the numbers, doing quite well. The stock market was, of course, doing well, which has impacts on people's 401ks, retirement plans, et cetera. And it's not, obviously, stocks are not just for the wealthy. Everybody has some skin in that game. And so by that measure, he was looking very strong. Naturally, in the time since then, and with the results mostly from COVID, we've seen the country turn into recession. The hope, I think, for everybody is that we get what's called a V-shaped recovery, where things went down and come back up very quickly. But at this point, one thing we took a look at is what happens when an incumbent president has a recession within 2 years of his presidential election. That is, in the last 2 years of his first term, does he have a recession? And when you go by historically, the only president to have faced a recession in those last 2 years and then win re-election is Calvin Coolidge. Long way to look back, 100 years, but consistently we've watched those recessions, obviously in combination with other elements, but those recessions bring down incumbents when those incumbents have lost. And so I think, of course, economic progress is something that people care very much about. I actually think in this cycle, it's going to be as much about economic momentum as raw numbers, but certainly going into recession makes it more challenging for President Trump than it would otherwise be. And then we can take, of course, a look at polls, and we'll take a look at national polls, but then we'll go at state polls, because as we talked about earlier, there really is a problem for Democrats looking at the national numbers because of the problem that Democrats have in the Electoral College. With that said, right now Biden has a stable and pretty strong lead. And I'll give you arguments on both sides of the aisle on this one, which is to say, on the one hand, Biden has never trailed in 2020. When you take a look at the national polls, there might be an outlier or two, but if you look at the average and you look across just dozens and dozens and dozens of polls, he has consistently led, and he's led at 50% average or more, which is where he is right now. And President Trump, of course, as an incumbent, sitting at around 40 to 42%, obviously that's problematic. So on the one hand, you take a look at that, and of course, you're concerned if you're the Trump campaign. I'll just say two things about that you just have to be a little bit cautious about. The first is that this is a very turbulent time, and lots has happened. Second, the Trump team, as we'll see a little bit later, has a large financial advantage, which they can use to define Biden in a way that he hasn't been defined before. And you can expect, if you take a look at some of where these numbers are happening, if you take a look at some of the groups that have fallen down, a lot of them are groups that are going to naturally drift back to Trump. So you're seeing some softening among evangelicals, softening among certain segments of traditional Republicans. My guess is that over time you'll see this tightening, irrespective of what happens and what happens over the next month or two. Let's take a look at the next slide. Now, here's where all the action really is right now. You know, there's what's called a few different parts of the country. There's what's once called the Democratic Blue Wall, and those are states like Pennsylvania, Wisconsin, and Michigan. Those are states that all flipped to President Trump last time around. In 2016, he won Pennsylvania by a point. In 2016, he won Wisconsin by a point. In 2016, he won Michigan by just a hair, 0.3 of a point. If you take a look at polling today, in all three of those cases, you see pretty dramatic swings back to Biden, which is to say he's leading in Michigan. Again, this is looking at averages of polls by about 8 or 9 points. He's leading in Wisconsin by about 6 points. He's leading in Pennsylvania by 6 points. Then you add in some of the other states, which you could call the reach states for Biden, where he would want to work to cut into some of Trump's territory. And those are states like North Carolina. It's a state that President Obama won in his first election in 2008. Trump won that by nearly 4 points. Biden's now leading by 2. You add in Arizona, which is a state that, you know, is one that Democrats have wanted for a long time, which has become more Hispanic over time, and just elected a Democratic senator. You take a look at that, Trump won that state by 4 points, Biden's winning by 4 points. So in each of these swing states, what I think is really compelling, probably the most important takeaway, is that they are moving alongside the national mood. We're seeing the state, as Biden builds a lead of 8 or 9 points nationally, these swing states are coming up with them. They're not moving in different directions. And so again, what I think is imperative and incumbent on the Trump campaign is to start to bring things more in line with Biden nationally, rather than worry about the states at this point, because that's where you bring those floodwaters down a little bit. That's when the states become a little bit more competitive and start to move together, or move in ways that I think will be more helpful for his campaign. Maybe we'll take a quick break before we, well, just one quick thing is on fundraising. President Trump has been extremely successful. Now, Joe Biden has been bringing up to level, and I think there's an argument to be made that as Sanders supporters and some of the online armies that have been so strong in parts of the Democratic circles rejoin into Biden's camp, that you might see Biden taking a bit of an advantage to raise money from small donors. But with that said, Trump has, you know, raised hundreds of millions of dollars. He retains an advantage not just in fundraising, but in cash on hand, and has quite a bit of a war chest that he can use an advantage right now. So with that, why don't we open that up before I think we're going to go next to the Senate, just to hear what other folks think.
Yeah, and want to hear from Rick and Mike. You know, one thing I was going to ask you, Doug, I hear coming from lots of Democratic friends, is they see all this polling and they almost don't want to look at it. Still suffering PTSD from 16, where they remember favorable polling for Hillary. But what would you say the biggest differences are between what we saw in 16 and what we see now? I mean, the thing I find myself thinking of is how many voters didn't like either option, and whether, and I also think about the total lack of effort by the Hillary campaign in places like Wisconsin, Michigan, and to a lesser extent, but significantly, Pennsylvania. Do we have a situation now where Joe is significantly more likable, and so that the dynamics are significantly different, or is a similar scenario plausible as we get closer to November? You were nodding in that direction as we looked at some of these numbers.
So to my mind, I think Biden's a little bit more, is better liked, I think, than Hillary overall, that she already at this point in the campaign had much higher unfavorables than Biden did. I think the second thing working in Biden's favor is, you brought up an important point there, George, is what happens to the people that hate them both, right? The way American politics goes these days, by election day, pretty much a good portion of the electorate dislikes both candidates. In 2016, they broke dramatically for Trump. But in surveys that we're seeing right now, they're breaking more for Biden, which is to say, if you dislike them both, the dislike of Trump has taken on a different form than it did in 2016. I think in 2016, it was maybe a dislike of personal characteristics, but an excitement for change made them say, okay, I don't like that about him. And I'm just talking, of course, of people that dislike him versus a dislike of Hillary at the time. They say, well, I dislike Trump, but he'll move things in a different direction. He might have something good. I dislike Hillary, and it's just going to be the same. If you take a look at this, dislike of Biden, I think, is something that's a little bit easier for people to get over, especially against an incumbent president.
Hey, Doug, I have a question. It's been 4 years. If you look at Trump's base, older voters, unfortunately, some of them have died off. And then if you look at the Biden folks, a lot of them are younger. My own daughter, it's her first election she's ever able to vote in. She's very excited. How much do you put it to just the change of the electorate itself?
What's so fascinating is you can go back to like 1996 and open up books that say the end of the Republican majority, saying, you know, back in 1996, the growth of Latino populations, the growth of young voters, the end of the World War II generation. Republicans can never win another election. Well, they've gone ahead and won 3 since then. So I'm a little careful about looking at those demographic changes. I will say that it's not just about the fact that the electorate is changing. It's also the way that he's cut the electorate really threaded an inside straight in 2016. And I think the place where you're going to see the biggest drop off, you're right about some of these older voters. I think that he pulled a lot of ex-urban white voters. Of course, he pulled less educated voters too, but some of those ex-urban, better educated voters have moved more towards the Democrats over time. You saw that in 2018. Now, 2018 is not a guarantee of 2020, but I think if you look at that, that's where he's going to have the most serious trouble. The people who won't be able to send their kids back to school in the fall, the people who just, you know, it's not just about character now, it's about actual outcomes. That's what he has to win back to recreate that. So it goes beyond his base, but that's an important piece of it too.
So, George, maybe I'll put you on the spot on this one. We haven't talked about the vice presidential pick. Obviously, Biden campaign several months ago felt a lot of pressure to select a woman, so they committed to that. Now feeling a lot of pressure to potentially pick a minority female. But depending on how that shakes out, and if that vice presidential pick is someone even further to the left, you know, what impact might that have, particularly given, you know, how important moderate voters are going to be? You know, we talk about Biden's likability. How does that potentially change if suddenly a pretty far left vice presidential candidate's in the mix? What are your thoughts there?
Well, you know, history is pretty clear on this. Everyone gets very excited about VP picks, particularly as we head into the lull of a typical presidential election year. You're getting into July and we're used to hearing the same speeches, et cetera. This is different this year. You know, people get excited and it happens, and it has no effect on the presidential come November. I mean, you have a bit of evidence in modern political history, you know, Sarah Palin, for example, somewhat damaging John McCain, but, you know, at the margins, as you look at, you know, the final numbers in that election. So this one is different. You know, Doug can speak to this as well, but I think the average voter is very cognizant of the fact that of Joe Biden's age. You know, you hear talk about him potentially making a one-term commitment. So, you know, generally speaking, you can imagine voters factoring in the VP choice more heavily than they have in the past. Although even as I say that, I tend to think it's still not going to be a big factor. So for Democrats, you know, they keep their eyes sharply on Wisconsin, Michigan, Pennsylvania. What sort of a VP candidate helps the most there? You know, there had been some thinking that Amy Klobuchar would be the best choice there for some obvious reasons, and she's now out of the mix. So then if you game out an Elizabeth Warren or a Kamala Harris, how helpful are they in those 3 battleground states and some others? You know, brings people into conversations about addressing enthusiasm. I don't think enthusiasm is an issue with Democratic voters this go around. It was an issue, particularly, for example, in some places with African American voters in the last cycle. Do you need a Kamala Harris, for example, to fire up African American voters more to get out there? I don't think so. So I guess what I'm saying is I don't think it's going to matter as much as we feel it does right now. But in some ways, it probably does matter more because of Biden's age and the significant potential for him only serving one term. If you're asking me who I think it's going to be, I don't know. I think the most interesting name that's come into the mix lately that's intriguing some people is Susan Rice from the Biden administration. But I'd like to hear what Doug and maybe Rick thinks.
I'll just say one thing that, because I think George is absolutely right, that in the end, it's one of those things that's incredibly anticipated, then it happens, and then you get some people screaming, and then you go back to where you were. The real downside for Biden, I think, right now is that unlike most challengers, he wants less, not more attention at this point. That he's doing really well based on the focus being on President Trump. Other challengers, they're constantly doing what they can to get attention because the president gets to do presidential things. Well, the presidential things that President Trump has to do right now aren't helping him at all. And so the biggest challenge is, and it's not challenging, it's what he'll eventually need to do. Joe Biden will, if he really wants to be president. But the challenge is to try to make it so that he sort of keeps attention low, so it doesn't create a big target for the Trump campaign to shoot at, because that's what the Trump campaign is waiting for more than anything, is a misstep or a controversy. And so the presidential decision, whomever it may be, could become that for Biden. That's the only risk. But I think the most likely outcome is somebody that people shout about for a week, and then that becomes the second part of the poster for Biden.
So, I mean, we're clearly in a do no harm situation for Biden. So that would point you to the less audacious or bold choice. So is that end up being Warren? Does that end up being Harris? Look at the others. I'm not sure, but I think Doug makes a key point. There is no reason to go bold and audacious, like to stay with the McCain example he did with Palin. We'll see.
All right, let's continue on.
So we'll head to the Senate. I'm going to ask Doug a little later to address the coattail factor in the upcoming elections. I think it's really important this go around. But Rick and I will talk for a minute here about the state of play in the Senate. We have basically the inverse experience we had 2 years ago in the 18 cycle in terms of seats that are open for either party. So current balance of power, we've got 53-47 basically, with Bernie Sanders and Angus King caucusing with the Democrats. So it's been tight, and we've seen the Senate struggle to get a lot done because of that, the old 60 vote threshold for almost all things except nominations. And of course, Mitch McConnell has taken advantage of that, and they've spent a lot of their time in the Senate moving through nominations, which he said he was going to do. And when Mitch McConnell says he's going to do something, it usually happens. So now, as we look at who's up this cycle and the overall numbers, you can see in 18, as I mentioned, we sort of have the inverse now. In 18, Democrats were defending 24, Republicans only 9. And of course, in 18, it really couldn't have been a much worse situation for Democrats in terms of their ability, based on the states and races that were in play, to pick anything up in the Senate, even though they overall had a very good cycle, as evidenced by taking the House. The map just didn't set up for them well in 18. And consequently, the Republicans actually picked up 2. We flipped things as we look at this cycle. So we went from 24 Dem, 9 GOP, and we've got 12 Dems, almost all in safe seats, with the exception of Doug Jones down in Alabama. There's some thought that Gary Peters could have some trouble in Michigan, but really it's more about those 23 Republican incumbents. And as I say, I'm gonna ask Doug to talk about coattails in a minute, but that's going to be an important factor in these Senate races. So looking at the numbers, there are really 5 races we're all watching most closely, and Democrats only need a pickup total of 4 to win control of the Senate. And as we sit here today, their prospects for not only 4, but maybe even 5, and maybe just a tick north of there are very much in play. Excuse me. So you can see how things break down as we look at the races that are viewed as safe versus likely Republican. We see that gray 5 is the key number, and we see the toss-ups in that bottom band. You've got 5 Republicans considered toss-ups and 0 Dems. So that's the reality of what we're looking at in the Senate right now, and what Republicans are looking at. So just to look at those 5 races we're talking about specifically, we can't really talk about prospects for winning without talking about money. We can also look at polling here. The races people are watching most closely, Arizona for sure. This is not looking good for Senator McSally. I'm going to let Rick speak to that one. She's holding that office under somewhat unusual circumstances. Mark Kelly, former astronaut, is doing very well there, not just based on the polling you can see, but has had a lot of success on the fundraising front. In Colorado, incumbent Cory Gardner is facing off against the former, Senator Gardner is facing off against former Governor Hickenlooper. You may recall, if you're a real political junkie, that Governor Hickenlooper was briefly running for president. He dropped out and decided to run for the Senate seat. And as we're recording this, he's on the heels of having won a primary that actually ended up tightening up a bit more than expected. When it comes to Northeast Senate races, no one better qualified, at least on this call, but also generally speaking, to talking about those than Rick. So I'll let him talk about the Collins race, but she's in a real dogfight up in Maine. In Montana always kind of goes into its own special category. It's a red state that Trump won resoundingly, but they split tickets. They keep sending John Tester back to the Senate. Of course, Max Baucus was there for a long time, and you've now got Steve Bullock, who soon to be former governor, very popular there. Another guy that dipped his toe in the presidential candidate waters, and then decided to run for Senate as running against incumbent Steve Daines. And that's going to be a tight one. There aren't a lot of voters in that state. It seems like the races are always tight, but this is one that the Democrats can pick up as well. And then North Carolina, you've got another tight one with incumbent Tom Tillis, and that's just another one of what has become a deeply purple state, seemingly not able to decide whether it's going to be red or blue, and always in play. So those are the 5 main races, and Rick, I thought you might want to expand on those, but I think if we were going to generalize, and you can just see this based on the polling in that column, and you can even see in the fundraising that as we sit here today, Democrats are looking with good reason, feeling pretty optimistic about their ability to grab at least 4, if not 5, all 5 of these.
Yep. Thank you, George. I'd actually like to call on Doug because I have a question before I go into my thoughts here. I'd like to know what Doug thinks about ticket splitting or coattails.
Thanks, Rick. That to me is one of the most striking and important factors that we've seen in Senate politics over the last few years, or last few presidential cycles. So if you go back as recently as 20 years ago, states would vote for one candidate for president and a candidate of the other party for the Senate. In fact, about half the states back in, I think, 94 or 92, going back to 88, did you see states splitting their ticket between who they wanted for presidency and the party they wanted for Senate. By 2016, that number was exactly 0. No single state in 2016 voted for one party for the presidency and another party for the Senate. And just to show how extreme it is, we just did a poll, and I won't say where, for one of our clients, and we found 0% of Trump voters voting for the Democratic candidate and 1% of Biden voters voting for the Republican candidate for Senate. So right now, the notion of split ticket voting is extremely, it almost feels like a quaint concept. And this is because I think partisanship in a lot of ways has really dominated both the national but not just national at the presidential level, but the Senate level too. I think this has a couple of impacts as we look at this map. Number one is it just highlights the tremendous challenge that Senator Doug Jones has in Alabama. Trump is going to win Alabama by strong double-digit margins. And with those trends, it's just extremely difficult for him to overcome that. So in reality, Democrats take one seat off the table, unfortunately, again, for them, if you think about their prospects. But as you take a look at these 5 races, if you think about the top of the ticket, you know, if you think about who's going to win or not win, this is where Biden increasing his lead or Trump catching up is going to make all the difference in terms of the Senate. And by the way, just real quick, and this is something I think Rick can speak to really well, it also shows why senators have been so much less independent this time around than we've seen in cycles past.
Thank you, Doug. I don't disagree with anything you said or with George, except I would probably work around the edges and say that there's some of those Senate races that George mentioned that Republicans are battling for. They're actually doing a little bit better. Doug also mentioned that the president needs to stop throwing firebombs and really trying to bring down the rhetoric so he can take those states that he won last time and kind of bring it a little closer to Biden. Because one of the issues the senators really have to make is that you may have disagreements with the president, but the House of Representatives has already voted for DC statehood, which essentially adds 2 Democratic senators in perpetuity. Chris Coons, Democrat senator from Delaware, one of the most liked senators on either side of the aisle, one of the most bipartisan, has recently gone on record saying the first thing the Senate's going to do is end the filibuster. So therefore, judicial nominations, new states, Puerto Rico would be coming on as a new state, so now you're up to 4 Democrat senators in perpetuity. So you have to take those people in Colorado, you have to find those people in Maine, maybe some of those people in Michigan, the ones in Arizona that liked the president's tax cuts, that liked his judicial nominations. And you have to say, you need me, because without me, it all goes away. So I think the idea of having the president kind of bring his numbers up, drop Biden's a little bit, gives these Republican senators a real fighting chance. As you go around and you talk to activists around the country and you talk to donors, they're very concerned about this. So unfortunately for me as a Republican, what Doug says about splitting tickets has me a little concerned. But if you can make them close enough to even, I think there's a chance that you pull some of these off.
Yeah, and just to be clear, you know, I mentioned the data points, and to clarify, you're seeing polling numbers that make these Democrats feel optimistic, but you're also seeing the reality of being an incumbent, with the exception of the Arizona race, the fundraising advantage, and that still matters a lot. And one thing, Rick, I was going to ask you a couple things. One is just to sort of remind people why that Arizona race is a little different in terms of how McSally got into office and the reality of what's going on there.
Senator McSally in 2018 ran against now Senator Kyrsten Sinema. They both served in the House together. And it was a dogfight, no pun intended. McSally's a fighter pilot. It was like, I think McSally had 49% of the vote. Sinema had 50-point-something% of the vote. So she started out in a position where almost 50% of the people like her. Then current senator resigned his seat. The Governor Ducey put McSally into the seat with the idea that she would have to run in the next 2 years to fill out the remaining 4 years of the seat. She's running against former astronaut Mark Kelly, whose wife, Gabby Giffords, former House of Representative member, was a victim of terrible gun violence. So there is the idea of some sympathy, empathy for Gabby Giffords. Martha McSally is pro-gun. And then you have the idea of kind of a national hero in Mark Kelly, who really has no political record. He gets to talk about looking down from the moon and from the stars. And so, you know, McSally's, she's got a record, and she's been banged up, and she's run twice in 4 years.
Yeah. Yeah, so that one's a little different, and you can see that's, you know, it's not looking good for McSally. The only other one I was going to ask you before we move on, Rick, just to hit on is Maine. Maine is a unique political state. I talked about the unique dynamics in Montana. I think of Maine as being a different kind of state as well. But just the prospects that Susan Collins may not make it through that race against Sarah Gideon.
So Maine is the perfect example of what the country has become. Every Senate race is nationalized to the extent for raising money. Susan Collins has been a very longstanding independent voice for Maine. She happened to vote for Justice Kavanaugh, and that started a national flood of money against her before she even had an opponent. She is the only Republican statewide member of Congress, or only Republican member of Congress in New England. New England has changed. Most of your conservative people left the high taxing part of New England and they went down south. Susan Collins is in the toughest race of her career. I still believe in the end, ekes it out. Gideon is not a perfect candidate. She's had missteps along the way. And Senator Collins is running a very, very good race. But again, it'll be a tight one. And Maine is one of those unique states presidentially that splits the state. And the second district, I believe it is where Trump does well. So she will really have to perform well there to make up the difference in the part where Biden most likely would win.
Right. Okay. Well, I think, Mike, unless you had anything else on the Senate.
Yeah, one quick one before we leave the Senate. So in 2018, I guess taking it from, you know, individual Senate races, how that might play out in the Senate balance, but looking at committees themselves. So in 2018, you know, thinking of a race that had a domino effect for committee leadership was, you know, the Florida race where Senator Nelson, who had been ranking on the Commerce Committee, lost, and then the dominoes fell to where Senator Cantwell from Washington took over. Do you all see, or can you project out any races that are looking like that, you know, close toss-ups where, you know, if the incumbent loses, that committee dominoes might fall in a way that kind of shake things up?
I would actually just look at your Commerce Committee. Either way, you get a new chairman there, because Senator Roger Wicker most likely goes and takes the Armed Services Committee in a new Congress if they were to stay in the majority. Other than that, I really, well, the Finance Committee, Ron Wyden versus Chuck Grassley, that's just a switch, but not somebody losing. I guess they would all have impacts if the Senate switches.
Yeah, but I don't see the kind of cascade you're thinking of here, Mike. It's more just we just look at the change, right? And then, you know, another committee we pay close attention to, the Energy and Natural Resource Committee. Senator Murkowski's handing that gavel off anyway, but if Democrats take control, then it's Joe Manchin, and if Republicans retain, then it's presumably going to be Brasso. So we can, you know, we're not going to see cascades quite as you are thinking of, but as we think ahead to changes, you know, I don't see anything that really alarms me for this industry and how we've positioned ourselves. But we're going to have some changes no matter what, in part because Republicans still have term limits on these committee chairs, and then Wicker making a presumed move if given the opportunity. Okay, so move on. And by the way, when we wrap, we'll talk a little bit more about what the results of all this could mean for ASA and for the issues we care about. But I'll take us to the House. What we're looking at there, you can see the current numbers as they stand today. We actually have some vacancies, but the the balance power pretty heavily in favor of Democrats. And of course, unlike the Senate, where for most things you still have to find 60 votes to get through and even have something considered, debated. In the House, whoever's got the majority can kind of move the things through that they want to move through. That's a significant advantage. And of course, much of that advantage was a result of the 18 cycle, and Doug mentioned this already. A lot of attention was given to AOC and some other members that came into the House as freshmen who were way out on the left, liberal fringe of the Democratic Party. But if you actually look at the makeup of the freshmen who came in to change the balance of power in the House, most of them were of a more moderate stripe. So the moderate Blue Dog coalition in the House was reconstituted, biggest numbers it's had in 10 or so years. There's another coalition that's slightly left of the Blue Dogs, the New Dems, but they're also pretty moderate and very much pro-business. And so if we look at what it's been like, I think people's expectations of what the House might do, how it might behave under Nancy Pelosi's leadership, and how much she might have to kowtow to the AOCs of her caucus. A lot of the legislating the House has done has been a little bit more pragmatic and business friendly, I think, than some expected. So as we look at the prospects for a change here, I'd say it's far less likely than a change in the Senate. Of course, everyone's up when we think about the House of Representatives. You see this year being another example we've seen in recent years of lots of Republicans heading for the exits. So that just makes it tougher for Republicans to gain ground. You can see that when it comes to retirement, it's down somewhat from the last cycle, but still far more Republicans deciding to hang it up than Democrats. So this is similar to the bands we showed you before. While I say that the Dems, are looking more assured of keeping their majority, they are going to have some of the tougher races. You see Democratic toss-ups at 16 and only 6 Republican. And some, if not all of those toss-ups are sort of purplish, exurban type districts where moderate Democrats were successful in appealing to suburban voters. A lot of those voters Doug referenced earlier as being inclined to take a chance on Trump and shake things up a bit after a couple of years of that, decided that their sort of gamble there was not paying off as they had hoped, and they sort of turned back to some moderate Democratic alternatives. So,
and George, if I may just add one important point that I think fits into the House narrative, which I think points to how important it is for President Trump to improve his performance for Republicans. I saw a stat today that in 2017, right as President Trump was inaugurated, there were 248 Republicans in the House. Since then, over the last 3 years, 115, almost half, have either resigned, retired, or been defeated. So again, Democrats have faced this many times before, and during the Obama administration, a lot of Democratic legislatures were hollowed out, and certainly Democratic majority in the House was hollowed out. If President Trump can't turn this around, you could see the same thing happening in reverse, as you sort of seen consistently over the last few years of this administration.
Yeah, that's a critical point, and I saw that number too. That's about 48% of those House Republicans that were there as Trump took office. By the time we get past November and add in retirements, will be gone. That's incredible turnover in a short period of time, and you can interpret that in lots of different ways. But so, the bands you're seeing here, you'd think, oh, the Republicans have a reasonable shot. But if you think about the turnover they've had, they've struggled on the recruitment front. Overall, you add all these things up, and that's why people are generally bullish on Democrats retaining control of the House.
Yeah, I don't disagree, but I think there are some instances where seats flipped last time that Republicans have a great opportunity to get back. Speaker Pelosi, to fend off her left, went for impeaching the president. To fend off her left, she's also said that one of the first actions the House will take in the new Congress is to provide for a permanent salary for every citizen. That's kind of the talk that scares some people that may be willing to say, hey, I really like my member of Congress, but I'm going to vote for the next person because I don't want Pelosi there. So again, it's incumbent on the president to get some better numbers and for people to make those.
Yeah, mostly Pelosi, as we've tracked things along, has been successful in keeping these, if you see these 16 or so Democratic toss-up races where they're these are moderate Dems in tough races, she's been able to avoid forcing them to take votes that their challengers can use, but there's certainly some votes they have taken that, as Rick points to. But a lot of these moderate Dems voted against them, so they can hold that up and as reference to their credentials as independents. So that's how things are looking in the House. We covered the Senate, we covered the presidential. We bring these guys back in with sort of some concluding thoughts. I think one of the things we wanted to emphasize, I think that's very important for us all to remember as an industry, is that we've done an excellent job in the last 10 years or so of positioning this industry in a way that not only we can, avoiding harm that the new chair of some committee might bring to us, or people in running an agency in a new administration might bring to us. We've established a clear record of being sort of nonpartisan, bipartisan, if you will, and recognizing the fact that when it comes to fishing, where people do it, how they do it, and then also management of those resources, these aren't really partisan issues. And we've managed to get some things through Congress and get some things from the Trump administration, and even going back to the Obama administration, where our expectations were much lower, frankly, because of how we're presenting the economics of our industry, the participation in recreational fishing, and then making a strong case, for example, when it comes to marine fisheries, the nature of how those resources are currently divvied up, and the greatest and highest return on the use of those resources. So I think those are important things to keep in mind. And I want to get these guys' thoughts, committees, if there's a change in control of the Energy and Natural Resource Committee in the Senate, and we go from Lisa Murkowski, someone very closely aligned with commercial fishing interests, also, to be clear, someone who's always had a strong interest in recreational fishing needs. And we go to a Joe Manchin, who many of you know personally to be an enthusiastic fisherman and boater. There are things to take advantage of there. So I guess my point is, as we prognosticate what might happen in terms of House control, Senate control, I think the industry will continue to benefit from positioning ourselves in the middle, ready and able to work with members from both sides of the party from various parts of the country. Before handing it back to these guys, the only other thing I'd say is if we end up having a change in the White House and think about a Biden administration and who might be Secretary of Commerce, Secretary of the Interior, in key positions in the agencies that oversee resource management, or even things like trade policy or tax, I'm reasonably confident that you're going to have people in those agencies that are going to be eager to engage with this recreational fishing industry. I think, as we've watched in presidential campaigns, we've done an excellent job of sort of contributing to an overall effort to have presidential candidates and their transition teams, even more importantly, paying close attention to the engagement they carry out with the outdoor industry sectors. And I think we're only improving the likelihood of that happening based on, for example, the numbers that the Department of Commerce is now producing, showing how much economic might is associated with our industry and the outdoor rec industry in general. So we're well positioned. We've got to be smart about how we engage with the two campaigns, about how we are talking proactively with new members of Congress, or members of Congress who managed to survive their races, the way we position ourselves has really benefited this industry, and we need to make sure we continue to do that.
Yeah, George, I'll just add to that. I mean, there are opportunities and challenges no matter which party's in power of the White House or the House or Senate. You know, if you look at the Obama administration, Marine National Monuments was an issue we were really concerned with. And that was one where we made our case and demonstrated ourselves to be reasonable and showed the benefits that recreational fishing provides across the country. And we're able to get recreational fishing continued to be allowed in those areas. You know, over the last couple of years, changing Congress, there have been bills in the House that had been stalled for several years. The National Fish Habitat Bill, the Descend Act, you know, bills that I think wouldn't have had as much chance in the past of moving, and now we're seeing some activity on. You know, but there are things that move in the other direction. So, you know, I think again, demonstrating ourselves as bipartisan down the middle. You know, another great example that's recent is the Great American Outdoors Act, which is one not only ASA but the entire outdoor recreation community has gotten behind and has tremendous broad bipartisan support. You know, you'd like to think that no matter how partisan everything gets, that conservation and sportsmen's issues are still areas where both sides can come together and while they're fighting about everything else, still show that, hey, we can get some legislation done in a bipartisan way. And as more and more issues fall out of that bipartisan category, you know, optimistic that we can stay in it just because, you know, no matter where you go across the country, people are going to fish and the industry's there. And it's just a matter of making sure that members understand that importance. So this is all fascinating stuff that'll definitely have a bearing on the issues we work on, but it's really hard to do that calculation of, you know, net positive, net negative, just because the issues are so varied. And we'll do our best to make sure that it's positive no matter what, but you know, we work on so much stuff that it's hard to know from a big picture standpoint what the ultimate outcome would be. Doug, Rick, y'all have any parting thoughts for us?
My only parting thoughts are it's going to be fun. It's going to be exciting. A lot of mail-in votes. Buckle up. It'll probably take us a few days, maybe a few weeks to figure out how it all plays out.
Don't say a few weeks.
And I'll say, just to go along with Rick, the one thing you can expect over the next few months is the unexpected. And we're going to be talking about very different things in August, September, and October than we're talking about right now. So if you think you know what's going to happen, then just wait a couple weeks and you'll see how different things can be.
Yeah, so Doug's basically just saying ignore everything we just talked about and, you know, check back with you closer to November.
all predictions are true, or you get your money back.
All right, well, thanks so much, gentlemen. Really appreciate the insights. What's on the screen now is my contact information for anyone that has any questions. My email address is there, whether it's for me, George, Doug, Rick. Feel free to shoot me a note. We'll be happy to give you a response. George, Doug, Rick, thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it. And for everyone watching, thanks for bearing with us. A lot of great information. And hopefully Doug didn't totally undermine all of it with that last unexpected comment, but at least for this moment in time, hopefully there was some bearing to it. It'll be fun to watch this recording in November and see just how wrong everybody was. So, all right. Thanks, everyone. Take care.